Welcome to you all. I'm Ted Helms. I'm the Executive Director of the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce. And first and foremost, what I'd like to do is thank White & Case for this great space. As you can see, it smells, or maybe you can smell, it smells new, brand new spaces. Speaking of smelling new, the Chamber tomorrow is going to be moving its offices to a new location. In fact, as we're cleaning out all of our what we take, what we don't take, we found all these how to be a Brazilian. And we put them on the table because the alternative is going in the trash. So please, I welcome you to take one home with you. Years ago, when I was relatively new in Petrobras, I had a colleague from Petrobras give me that book. So I think it's legitimate and authentic. And so for especially those who are not Brazilian, take it and read it thoroughly. I would like to give special thanks to Paulo Vieira de Cunha. I find that this event he does also at the beginning of the year, where he brings together a panel. I'll let him introduce. At the end of those 2 hours, I find that I am in tune with Brazil. I was talking with Luisa. Luisa is Venezuelan. I spent many years there. I said, I know Brazil and I know Venezuela, but there's not to worry, people. We're okay. But I do want to give special thanks to Paulo because for the first time I've been in the chamber as I watch him go about organizing this. He does a great job. He puts a lot of effort into it, and I think we're all privileged to be here. I'd like just very quickly before Paulo introduces the panel, have John Vetterli from White & Case come up and give a few comments. And thank you very much.
Really just a quick word of welcome, and thank you all for coming. We're thrilled to be hosting this event again. It seems like every time we do it, it seems that Brazil has given us something timely to talk about. So this is always a very timely event, no matter what the year is. So once again, it's very timely. But again, just a quick word, because we all want to get to the excellent content from our panelists. But thanks very much for coming. White & Case is celebrating this year 20 years since we opened in Sao Paulo back in 1997 with one associate that I think he's here somewhere, but I won't embarrass him. Don Baker, many of you know him, went by himself to Brazil as an associate in 1997 when nobody was going there from the large international law firms, and has created quite a legacy for us there. So we're thankful for that. So this year we're celebrating our 20 years in Brazil, and obviously thrilled to be hosting this panel today. Thanks for coming.
Good morning. Thank you, John, and thank you for hosting us. Welcome, everyone. 6 months ago, we met to discuss the outlook. At the time, the main doubt was whether the Temer administration and its economic team would continue to produce and the economy adjust. They did. Temer delivered. His team delivered. And the economy adjusted. There were successes in the legislature, not the least the consequential change in the labor law. There was progress with the economy. By all accounts, the external adjustment is complete. The current account shows a surplus for the first half of the year, the first since 2008. Petrobras reassembled and is a big contributor to the exports of Brazil. The exchange rate is stable. There has been a return to price stability with inflation at 3%. And 12 months ahead expectations hovering at around 4%. We have credible monetary policy. And the policy space to reduce interest rates is there. Most probably, the Copom will cut rates later today. 100 basis points is what everybody is expecting. And most of us believe there are still more cuts to come. The pace of activity remains awfully low, but several indicators suggest that we have passed the turning point and the economy is starting to recover. The recovery, however, is very slow, and the main reason for it is Temer himself and the events of May 17th and thereafter. Once again, there was a hit to confidence and with it to investment. Expectations now are that the economy will basically stagnate in 2017. and growth will be less than 2% in 2018. What is worse, the Temer debacle calls into question the capacity of the government to deliver on the fiscal side. And fiscal adjustment is the critical roadblock to stability. For some reason, at some point, we accepted a promised 10-year-long fiscal adjustment plan. The plan had very few details, but somehow we believed in it. Now we don't even have this. The government may not deliver on its target for 2017. Most certainly, it will not deliver in 2018, not without revisions to the targets. The public debt increased from 71% of GDP to close to 76% of GDP in the last 6 months alone. And as we speak, there is no perspective for near-term debt sustainability. Yes, the markets remain resilient, and that is good, but then they may correct, and there is a long road to the elections in October next year. There are many doubts and uncertainties. We are fortunate to have an exceptional group of analysts to help us today. They are truly experts, each in their own way and in understanding what's going on in Brazil. I would like to thank them very much for accepting this invitation. You have their bios in front of you, so I will dispense with introductions. Among the panel, we have agreed to begin with the macro side, starting with Cassiana Fernandes for an overview with a bit of a focus on the fiscal, moving to Claudia Castro and Dani Tannenhauser, and then shifting to the country risk and ratings perspective with Shelley Shetty. And we will conclude this first round with an expert view on the political situation and its outlook led by Luisa Palacios. So thank you again for being here, and let's begin. Cassiana, please.
Sorry, just one moment so we can open the presentation. So thank you, everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much, Paulo, for the invitation. This is a great opportunity to talk about our outlook, and as you asked me to focus mainly on the fiscal side. Just 1 second, please. So the idea of yes.
Can you see, Cassiana?
Yes, I can see. So sorry about that. So I won't spend much time on the other points of the outlook. And as Paulo asked me just to go through in more detail on the fiscal accounts. But I think it's important just to put the story in context, at least in terms of the fiscal numbers. Just a long story short, Brazil has faced, and an emphasis here on the past of the tense of the verb, has faced one of its worst crises, with more than 8% points drop. 8 percentage points drop on GDP in the last couple of years since the end of 2014. But I think that's one. It's important to have what the consequences of this drop was a huge increase in public debt, as Paulo has just said. If we look back at the beginning, at the end of 2013, we had debt to GDP at 51%. Now it's already at 72.5, and we expect it to go up as much as 76% at the end of this year. And there are a lot of explanations explanations on reasons why we saw such an increase on debt in the last couple of years. It was a mix of a lot of policy mistakes, but also the recession has taken its toll. We saw, and you can see in the chart here, because of the recession, we saw the revenues, the fiscal revenues dropping quite a while in the last 3 years. But we also saw an important increase in expenditures, and that is a combination of policy mix, a lot of policy choices in the previous decade, but also the rigidity of the budget. Right now, roughly 90% of the expenditures are mandatory, and they cannot be cut. The government cannot reduce that without Congress support. If we go in the past, you can see that in the chart that back in 2014 we had the first primary deficit on fiscal accounts in Brazil since 1997. And now, this year, we are expecting again another primary deficit on fiscal accounts of around 2.2 percentage points of GDP. In order to fix those problems, as Paulo mentioned in the introduction, the government was able to approve at the end of last year the spending cap bill. What does that mean? That you cannot grow public spending more than last year inflation. So that would mean for the next 10 years, that would mean that 0% real growth in expenditures, and imagine that at some point growth will resume to its potential that we believe is around 2%. This law alone would lead to a gradual consolidation on fiscal accounts. But the story is not as simple as that. Why? Because then you have to look in terms of the composition of the public spending. What is needed for the government to comply, to be able to comply with the ceiling that they forced Congress and they were able to approve. And the problem is that if you look in the charts on the right, you can see the distribution of government spending in the last few years. And roughly, you can see that half of the government spending is with social security, is with public pensions. And if we look back in the last 8 years, it has been growing at a pace of 4%, 3 to 4% a year in real terms. And looking at demographic under current law, this increase should continue for the next 10 years, if not would increase. So that just calls the attention what is so important to discuss the pension reform in Brazil, and exactly just before May 17 events, I think there was a consensus among investors and all political analysts that the government was going to be able to approve some sort of the pension reform with some dilution with the negotiations in Congress. I mean, as in any place, but they were in the right path in order to approve that. And after May 17 events, that's definitely became a much more challenging negotiations. But I will let the political spectrum to Luisa to discuss about. Just on this, on the fiscal numbers, I think that the problem here is that if you have 50% of public spending growing at a pace of 4% a year in real terms, in order to comply with the cap, what we are saying is that the other half needs to decrease at a pace of 4% a year in real terms. And that's something that probably in not more than 5 years, that would mean a government shutdown. And this is clear. This is something that is not feasible happen. And then it comes to the discussion, well, why? What's the problem with the pension system in Brazil, with social security system in Brazil? Even if we go to an international comparison, you can see that Brazil, given the age of the population, already spends much more than its peers with social security. But the problem is that's not so easy to convince the society that, well, you need to lower your pensions and delay your retirement payments in order to convince, to help the fiscal accounts. And no other reason, if we look at the latest polls, roughly 70% of the Brazilian population is against any changes on the pension system, is against the pension reform. And a government that now has below 5% approval rate, that's something that is going to be very hard to be pushed before next year election. But then what we try to do in the exercise, just to work on the numbers. Okay, so if we are not going to be able to approve the pension reform, what does that mean? So we try to do an exercise and try to simulate what would be the public debt path with and without the pension reform. And I think here it's important to have in mind that's not just about the difference in terms of public spending, how much you can save in terms of public spending if you approve the reform or if you don't. It's also important to have in mind market perception in terms of risk aversion. Since the government just started to talk about the pension reform, when we saw an important increase in the confidence after the approval of the spending cap last year, we saw an important reduction in real interest rates in Brazil, in risk premium. So just to simplify the exercise, what we did was that, and May 17 events, I think it was also important, is that, well, with a pension reform, you can have real rates in Brazil roughly 160 bips below than without that. In my view, it's even higher, but just to show that the difference that we have in the two paths. And what does that mean? Well, even with a dilution of the original proposal of the government, and if they approve just the minimum age of retirement and the transition rule, we can see that in 10 years, you can see debt to GDP path stabilizing and gradually start to decrease. The tougher the reform approved, definitely the faster is going to be the reduction in the debt to GDP ratio. But then, but without that, we just don't see how. One, the government is not, as Paulo said, is not going to be able to comply with the ceiling that they approved, and the market is gonna charge the risk premium on the back of that. Probably in less than a year, we would see all the rating agencies downgrading Brazil again, and we see debt to GDP path not stabilizing at any time. We see it going up to almost 100% at the end of this by 2026. But I think that, and the importance of this exercise is exactly to highlight how important the pension reform is for all the economies, why we're talking so much about that. But I don't want to end my part with such a negative tone. I think we are definitely working under the assumption that, okay, not now, but after 2018 election, you're going to be able to elect a government and a Congress that is going to finally be able to push forward the pension reform, not on other reason, because there's not other way out. I think that's the important message of the exercise that we did. So just to go briefly, as I'm running out of time, and I really want to keep the budget here. So not to be accused that's just because I'm Brazilian, don't want to hit the ceiling. So just to go through very fast on the positive tones, because I think that the agenda that we are discussing in Brazil is not just about the pension reform. This is the most important one for fiscal accounts. It's important in terms also for productivity. You can say that Brazil has a very important structural problem, very low saving rates and declining in the last few years. The pension reform will definitely help to increase savings in the part of the public system, but also at the end, you can say that the pension reform would also be able to increase potential growth. Why? Well, everyone would need to work for longer. You increase labor force. That should be positive for GDP. So, on the back of the reforms, we already approved the labor reform. I think that was a very important reform, not only to give flexibility to the labor market, but also to reduce the costs of local corporates and dealing with labor. Also, a very important measure that is under discussion is exactly the changing what we call a financial reform, rethinking the role of public banks in Brazil, reducing the subsidies in terms of subsidized interest rates, the TLP, BNDES benchmark interest rates. I think this is definitely a very important reform in terms of giving more efficiency to the market, reducing the distortions, the misallocation of capital by bringing the private sector, but also in terms of increasing efficiency of monetary policy. There is a huge agenda of the government in terms of infrastructure projects, privatizations, changes in regulations to increase competitiveness. I think this is also something that this economic team has been doing a very good job in terms of trying to push forward that. And at latest, the other thing that the government will need to do at some point is in terms of fiscal reforms. If at this point it's very hard to decrease tax rates in Brazil, but just to simplify the tax system, I think that one thing that stands out, the third line on the table, is the time it takes to deal with taxes in Brazil in comparison to OECD countries, 163 hours, Latin America 342, and then Brazil 2,038 hours. So it's something that shows the competitiveness bottleneck that we have. And just here, the disclosure from my compliance, everything that I said is just my opinion. And I pass to Claudia.
Thank you very much, Cassiana. That was excellent. Now we go to Claudia, please.
Thank you, Paulo, for being here. It's a pleasure to be here and also address the audience. I think I'll start a little bit differently from a market's perspective, and then tie that to the macro, inevitably with some overlap with Cassiana and probably the others as well. In terms of the market and especially fixed income, I have to say the resilience of the markets, I think, has a lot to do with the global environment, and a lot less so with Brazil specific. It's been very beneficial to EM, to emerging markets in general, the fact that global interest rates are very low, that inflation is very low, therefore global liquidity is, there. And I think a lot of the idiosyncratic events that happened in the year or in the last recent months, not just in Brazil, but in other countries as well, that did not spark a lot of market reaction or surprisingly little market reaction in terms of price moves, would not have been so if we were not in this benign global environment. So this is, I think, an important point to make. Brazil itself, I think one of the anchors for the market has been the economic team. Definitely the fact that Finance Minister Meirelles and Central Bank Governor Ilan Goldfein were there, reassuring that economic policy was not really going to change. And not only that, actually recommitting themselves at every point in time to pursuing the reform agenda, and actually that they wouldn't really have a plan B, but that they were in control of the process. That was very, very important and allowed, I think, investors to have some comfort that if the Social Security would not pass this year, and it wouldn't really be so beneficial for the near-term years, so investors could perhaps contemplate the idea of waiting for 2 years and have the new administration pass the reform. So that was one point out there. So I think following the May 17 crisis, the outlook became a little bit for the market like in the short term more political turbulence, but with a constitutional path to follow, no political vacuum as perhaps in other countries you could see, and an economic toll for sure because of delayed reforms, but nevertheless a recession being over and as the cycle was terminating, and not a robust recovery, but some recovery in sight. And I'll tackle this a little bit more in just a minute. Then on the medium term, the benign, let's say, assessment would be remain constructive insofar as the economic policy staying on course, and insofar as there was or there is a political understanding that the lack of reform would generate not only hurt the economic recovery, but possibly generate also an economic crisis. And I think Congress, to some extent, has demonstrated that it could work along those lines, and there would be political implications if they would behave, let's say, as they were behaving in the past administration with ex-President Dilma, for example. So they did pass some things, they did cooperate. And then over the long term, the outlook became or remained one of the crises attempting to have some prophylactic effect, if you will, in terms of greater transparency and stronger institutions. There is a question mark here, however, I think that is legitimate, with the conviction and potential conviction of President Lula. How will Lava Jato progress, the car wash investigations? Is it sort of the end of it, or sort of the peak, something like that? I mean, there is, I think, agreement or consensus that the political class as a whole cannot be criminalized. And so if you take that into account, you could come to the idea of a limit to Lava Jato. So that's one consideration there. So taking all this into account, for market investing, the locals were bearish, the local investors were bearish because of the corruption and the political uncertainty. They understood, as the foreigners, the biggest malaise being the fiscal side, not much room for maneuver there, as Cassiana was demonstrating. But given the global environment, a lot more favorable to cyclical, and Brazil being out of recession from negative to positive in that sense, that you could actually still have Brazil holdings, despite the fact that valuations were stretched and higher, and the political uncertainty was higher, and there wouldn't be a lot of visibility of reform. So that's a little bit how it played out. Now, just in terms of a few points that I think are worth mentioning from the macro side. I can't elaborate on them because of time limitations, but in terms of the recovery that is on course, some signs of that. The part of investment, of domestic demand, but specifically investment collapse. Real investment actually fell by around 30% between the beginning of 2014 to the beginning of 2017. And there are some factors that support the recovery of investment, but there are some factors that are a drag to the recovery of investment. They are important. And clearly the support is that interest rates are coming down, so funding costs are coming down. You have a stabilization of terms of trade, so profitability for those are, better. But on the other side, it's important to note the medium-term growth prospects for Brazil have been revised down. So there's a decline in expected returns from that. Corporate leverage is high, has stabilized, but is high. And so you have this problem of investment funding there. And you have the issue of policy uncertainty. Insofar as debt to GDP actually is unsustainable or is not stabilizing for the next couple of years, this policy uncertainty is likely to linger for a while. And so that is damaging to the recovery of investment. And so this is really linked to both the politics relating to elections, continuity, the reform agenda, especially the pension, but also this issue of the government debt levels rising for the next several years. So the idea of persistence as well, right, on this policy uncertainty, that is important. Now, just going back to the medium-term growth prospects, because that is the largest room for policy action that the authorities have, really. That has to do, of course, with productivity and competitiveness, and estimations show that with some modifications, because Brazil is so behind its peers on that level, in terms of the Brazil cost of doing business, tax systems, it can actually gain as much as 2 percentage points of GDP. And that is really a lot. The government has introduced a micro package of reforms, and I think it's important to mention there are 47 micro measures. They mostly are related to the Ministry of Trade and Industry. 24 of these 47 measures are related to foreign trade, and they have to do with digitalization, computerization, standardization of products. So this kind of reforms. I think the business climate over the last 2 years has been in a worse position than before, both because of policy, the public banks, expansion of public banks, as well as the state intervention, as, for example, the electricity sector, and also not just the policy side, but also on a structure way, the tax system. So the tax system is indirect and regressive, and that's part of the Brazil cost. And if you look from a firm perspective, you also see that the tax system, in the sense of misallocation of resources, is also a hindrance, a very big hindrance to productivity. because it really distorts the capital labor allocation and subsidizes to some extent inefficient companies. And so that's where you get this estimate by some studies where you can have total factor productivity increase by 50%, and therefore GDP on an annual basis increase by 2%. If you were to have a sort of fully efficient market or fully efficient, transition to let's say to the countries that are leading or more efficient. So the policy here clearly is on the tax side, and I think the authorities have some leeway there. It's a key challenge to get away from this distortive side, and to continue the micro agenda, which the government, has also some leeway there. Then more specifically, I think the government should think of the tax disparity between capital and labor. I think this is the biggest part where it can make a difference on capital, especially capital imports. And so this is really talking about improving productivity with existing resources. So that's why I think this is so important. And then the other thought I would put out there is the issue on the consumption side, the disinflation versus unemployment issue there, and the impact on real incomes. You can think you're having a very, very large disinflation process happening in Brazil. At the same time, you're having very, very large unemployment readings. And so we have to think what of the rise of the middle class in Brazil. I mean, that was a theme that we had been championing for quite some time, not just in Brazil, but in emerging markets. And, really the litmus test was the sustainability of that, right? So I think that it's important to note that recession, hits really the most is earnings from work, and that's really the main source of income for the poor. And I think this is really where it gets tied, to the issue of inequality and to the issue of this rise of the middle class. So I think to preserve equality gains, as income growth declined and formalization declined, the government has to think of better use of social benefits. It has the program, the Bolsa Familia, as we all know, that has had some success, but it can do a lot better. It has, as I mentioned, it can do a better use of the tax system. And another very important element that is shown to hurt equality very specifically, more than other elements, is the growth of civil servants' wages. And that's another very important point. So I think we have not seen up to 2015 to conclude signs of reversal inequality if we look to the household surveys of the government that the government produces. But since the recession, given 2016-17, I think we're bound to see that. So I think that would be a very important thing for investors to see that there are some initiatives in that direction and that the future administration might be able to think and take that into account. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Claudia. That was really quite interesting. And I know we always should be reminded that in Brazil, in addition to the conjunctural short-term problems, which are quite a challenge at the moment, there is always this longer-term issue that productivity has been so low, and that the growth prospects for the economy keep coming down, even on a longer-term basis. And clearly, there are many issues that are difficult to tackle on trying to bring up these longer-run growth. And with this, I'll turn to Danny. I think you will help us understand some of these issues a little bit better. Please.
Thank you very much. And what I'll try to do in my bit, by the way, how much am I? 10 minutes?
10, 12 minutes.
I want to make sure that I don't
Yeah.
hit the ceiling here. Okay. So what I'll try to do is to kind of like put everything that came out of Cassiana and Claudia in perspective when it comes to markets. I'm very much of an interest rates and FX trading person. So where I believe there is value in Brazil, right, it really is when you look at that saddle or that point that Cassiana mentioned, 2021. So if you look at where the implied interest rate for the central bank is in 2021 contract and the futures in Brazil, that level is about 11%, right? With inflation around 3% right now. This is like by far the highest real interest rate in the world. If you go and you look into Argentina, right, you are at real interest rate of what, 2-3%, depending how optimistic you are on inflation in Argentina. If you go to Turkey, you are probably at 1%, 2% real rates. Brazil, you have 8%, right? Why is that the case? Why is 2021 so important, right? 2021 is really the point where we're going to see Brazil hitting the ceiling. That's the point, the deadline the market is giving to Brazil to pass social security reforms. In the meantime, the market is happy enough to run along the balance of payments story. So what I'll try to do here is to try to put in perspective the balance of payments theme, which Claudia mentioned when it comes to foreign investors and the flows into Brazil, together with the productivity story, and fit those two in some shape or form, right? So Brazil has a very serious productivity problem. That productivity problem is being partially solved with the labor bill that just went through, the TLP bill, which is hopefully going to go through over the next 4 to 6 weeks. On one side, you're going to be tackling inefficiencies in the labor market. On the other side, you're going to be tackling inefficiencies in capital allocation, right? What has happened so far over the past 5 to 6 years is that inefficiencies in the labor market came across big inelasticity. So you had issues with contracts, right? You just can't fire people. And I'm sure it's good that we're sitting here in a law firm. I'm sure you're very familiar with that. You make a lot of money out of trying to break those labor contracts in Brazil that you cannot, which is great, right? Because it just keeps going. Right? And then on the other side, you have an issue, which is the TLP. So you have essentially 2 interest rates in Brazil, right? One of them is the interest rate that foreign investors see. The other one is, I would call it the corruption rate. Right? So to access that rate, you need to pay someone, or you needed to pay someone, right? Now, to give you an idea of what the subsidies have been, right? So last week, Mansueto Almeida put together a very, very thorough analysis, very short. Unfortunately, it's only in Portuguese. I have to talk to these guys because they should translate it. It's really, really good where he goes through the implicit subsidies that took place as a result of having a sovereign-controlled financial system. Right? And in that, the number for the past 10 years, so this is since 2007, is 724 billion reais, right? If you go and you actually look into the federal police, they actually tell you that they are controlling about 1.4 trillion reais in accounts in banks in Brazil, right? If you actually do a third analysis of that and you look into the loss of market capitalization of Petrobras, Banco do Brasil, CVRD, and so on throughout the crisis, you actually reach a number that is somewhere around 1 trillion reais, if you put into that OGX and so on and so forth. So that is in itself the problem that you have when it comes to capital markets in Brazil and capital allocation, right? The TLP will solve that problem. Why? Because it will unify market rates with the rate that is given by the BNDES. And as a result, what the BNDES will be doing, they will be providing capital, long-term capital to firms that cannot access long-term contracts. So if I need money for 5 years, I will get money for 5 years at market rates. I won't get money for 5 years at 2%, right? And why? Because there is no one to pay for it. Right, so that story is over, and here is why Lava Jato is so important, right? Because the combination of the TLP bill together with Lava Jato brings back efficiency into Brazilian capital markets. Now, just to put this in perspective, and I know again that I'm in a law firm, so I don't want to talk too much about regressions and co-integration and matrix inversions, but what we have here is basically two distinct models. On your left is a balance of payments framework, where what we try to do here is we try to understand what is the exchange rate required to close the external gap that Brazil has, right? So if you have a negative number, it means that the Brazilian real needs to appreciate to adjust the external side. And what you see in there is that the currency was overvalued until about a year and a half ago. And over the past year and a half ago, you had a massive adjustment with the currency becoming a lot cheaper. Now, why did that happen? Very simple. A, you had a recovery in foreign flows, which is what Claudia mentioned. But B is actually a big contraction in domestic demand in Brazil. Right? So basically you had those high real interest rates, inflation collapsed, the central bank did not catch up with the drop in inflation, and as a result, consumption dropped, unemployment increased, and you had an improvement in the external balances. Brazil is not exporting, well, they are exporting more, but the big story really is coming from a drop in imports and an improvement in the flows. And once you combine those things, the currency looks undervalued. Right? So the main theme coming from people trying to suggest that you should be invested in Brazil is that Brazil has a massive improvement in the current account, which is correct, right? But again, that issue will go away if you don't manage to improve productivity in Brazil. And this is what you have in the second chart to your left. In that chart, what we do is we fit the real effective exchange rate to three things: foreign direct investment, terms of trade, and productivity. And in that chart, you see that when Lula actually took office in 2003, right, Brazil is looking a lot better. And the reason being that there was an improvement in productivity in Brazil through the FHC years. So the years when PSDB was running the government, there was an improvement in productivity through many different shapes and forms, right? The implementation of inflation targeting regime, a drop in real interest rates. There were many things that happened, but more than anything, BNDES balance sheet remained fairly constrained, right? Since then, what has happened is that BNDES started lending money at below market rates. Right? And as a result, you basically stimulated a deeply unproductive sector in Brazil. So that's point number one. Point number two, labor contracts became a lot less flexible. So you could still hire people, you just couldn't fire them, right? That was the problem. You had to pay an amount of money to the unions in Brazil. Right? That's the labor unions in Brazil. And as a result, you ended up, I think, 17,000 labor unions you have today or something like that. It's something real. You have you have a union of unions. So you have you have the labor union of people that work in labor unions. Right? It's ridiculous, right? And the reason, and there was the whole thing about like the mortadella sandwiches, right? I mean, all the money that came for people to go into demonstrations, street demonstrations in Brazil, right? You could fund all of that through those inefficiencies that were introduced over those years. Now, the labor bill was passed, and we are moving back in time. So the labor markets in Brazil are becoming more efficient. They are becoming more productive. In the meantime, what has happened is that the exchange rate became more expensive. So where we are today when it comes to productivity, the Brazilian real is somewhere around 10 to 15% overvalued. Okay, so and you have those two stories that they diverge. It's incredible. When you look at them, how clear it is, the balance of payments. So you go and you meet with a bull guy. The bull guy will tell you, oh, the balance of payments and the flows are incredible and the foreigners and so on. And then you talk to like mostly the Brazilian guys, like, oh, this place is going to fall apart, right? And you can clearly see that coming from those two stories. So the current account, again, just to give you a few numbers, right? In March 2013, the current account deficit in Brazil was around 80 billion. Now it's about 20 billion. This is rolling of 4 quarters, right? So Cassiano might tell you, no, this number is wrong. So this is more or less rolling, okay? So but you can see that the improvement in the current account happened in many different emerging markets. So you see that happening in India, Indonesia, South Africa, Turkey. The improvement in the current account story is not only unique to Brazil, right? 5 minutes, okay. Terms of trade in Brazil, that's one of the main triggers. They have been improving. So again, we turned from very positive. There was a big story supporting the deterioration in the productivity. That's one of the big stories that would force productivity to start improving now, is because the terms of trade are still very, very weak when it comes to Brazil. Right, and this chart is the one that I would like to focus a little bit, and that touches the leverage story that Claudia mentioned. And I think that the leverage started to improve, but it's still very high. So what you see in this chart is essentially a breakdown of household and non-financial corporate debt as a share of GDP, and you see that very meaningful increase really beginning in 2010, 2011. So the leverage in Brazil, Lula, I think Lula, there's Lula 1.0, right? And then there's Lula 2.0, and then there is Dilma, right? So Dilma is like, you really basically went out there, right? You are literally giving money away for nothing in return. Right? Whereas with Lula, there was a deterioration. Lula 2.0, there was a slight deterioration. Lula 0.1 essentially was a PSDB government, right? And you can see this very clearly in this chart. Now, the most important thing out of this chart that you need to keep in mind is that when we started this whole mess, okay, the private sector financial system granted 70% of credit in Brazil, right? With the public sector granting about 30%. Today, the picture is the exact inverse of that, right? So the financial system in Brazil is essentially run by the government. It's 70% run by the government, right? And is incredibly inefficient. So one of the key things is that you're going to have a delevering, but also you're going to have more efficient players in that market. You're going to have Itaú coming back. You're going to have, other Bradesco, maybe other private banks that will be a lot more active. This is the flow story you know by heart, so I'm not going to touch that. So last but not least, and then I'll stop here. This is a chart where basically we show the non-financial credits, the portion of FX debt of non-financial credit over GDP, right? The good thing about Brazil is that Brazil has a deep domestic market. For instance, Mexico, okay, needs to fund 3 times the amount in dollars than they fund locally, right? Brazil doesn't need that much of dollar funding when it comes to non-financial corporate debt. And the reason is because they do have a deep domestic market that as interest rates converge lower, right, you're going to have access to. And as a result, you could actually have a much more stable outlook when it comes to an improvement in productivity going forward, because you could get that lending going forward. So again, our view is that by 2021, Brazil will solve the Social Security problem because they have no other way. They have no way out of it, right? They will have to. I think May 17 this year proved to be a very interesting test to the political system in Brazil. They got it, right? They understand that they cannot play with markets anymore. So from that perspective, we think that the productivity story will be the positive theme going forward.
Thank you, Danny. That was really, really provocative and excellent. And I think you highlighted some of the key issues going forward and bringing in this a little bit time longer dimension. And to pull it all together in terms of what this all mean, we are very happy to have Shelley Shetty with us. As we all know, ultimately the interest rate in Brazil is conditioned or is contained by the credit rating and the risk spread of Brazil. So we are very fortunate to have a ratings perspective analysis of what's going on in Brazil. Thank you.
Thanks, Paulo, and thanks to the Chamber for inviting us and for us to be able to share our perspective. I guess the title of this presentation kind of tells it all, right? Ratings are under pressure in Brazil. That's not an understatement at this point in time. Maybe in the next few minutes, I guess, there are three main things that I want to discuss. First, talk about Brazil and compare its credit metrics with respect to its rating peers. Second would be talking a little bit about our recent rating affirmation along with the negative outlook. And third would be really talking a little bit about the chief challenges that we're seeing in Brazil at this point in time. Very quickly on this chart, this just shows the rating trajectory of Brazil in recent years. Brazil lost its investment grade in December 2015. That coincided with the start of the impeachment process. We went down by another notch to BB in May of 2016, so just over a year ago. That was just before the Temer administration was going to take office. It was clearly not a reflection of our view on where the policy orientation might go under President Temer, but it was really saying that the adjustment process was going to start from a much more difficult starting point with large fiscal imbalances and a growing debt burden. Since then, we've basically maintained the negative outlook. Our most recent rating affirmation was exactly the one day after the breakout of the news on May 17th, and I'll come back to that in a minute. We affirmed the rating but sustained the negative outlook. So this kind of gives you a picture of where Brazil stands with respect to its rating peers. I think a couple of points I would make here. First, Brazil is no longer a loner in the BB category, being such a big, diverse emerging market. Now, we also have countries like South Africa and Turkey, which have also lost investment grade at Fitch. So the comparisons and in terms of anchoring Brazil in the BB category perhaps is becoming easier because we also have other benchmark credits that have moved into the BB category. But then there's another point, and that point is that if you look at broader BB and the BB minuses, what you really see are countries which are either institutionally less developed or just much less economically diverse with lower per capita income. So, BB category countries, you've got Guatemala and Paraguay in the BB category. They're there because the debt burden is low, but institutionally much weaker than Brazil. In the BB minus category, you again have countries in like Bolivia or Bangladesh or Vietnam, not very diverse countries. You've got countries like Serbia, where macroeconomic instability is not well entrenched. You've got Seychelles, which is also something, a country that defaulted a few years ago. And you have countries like Dominican Republic, which, also have very weak external liquidity positions. So I guess the picture that I'm trying to portray here is, Brazil, anchoring Brazil in the BB category is obviously one of the challenges that we do face. Now, very quickly on this traffic light table, this in a snapshot gives you how Brazil compares to its BB median. Clearly, where it does weaker is economic growth. We've talked a lot about that. 5-year economic growth is really a negative number. We also have inflation. If you look at 5-year average, and as rating agencies, we do tend to look at averages and longer term rather than near-term improvements. And there again, Brazil doesn't do that well. And clearly, it's off the charts on public finances and the government debt burden, which is significantly higher. On the positive side, where Brazil does do well is its per capita income level, which is clearly much above the BB median, but also its external position, which is really a standout in the BB category. Here, I'm not only talking about the current account deficit, which has obviously come down quite a bit, but it's very strong net sovereign external creditor position, which gives it a lot of maneuverability to face shocks. The other two charts that I wanted to talk about were, if you look at the top chart, that basically, shows Brazil compared to the BB median and some of the other countries which also have heavier debt burden. So here, you can compare Brazil to countries like Croatia, Portugal, Serbia. All these countries also have a pretty heavy debt burden, which is higher than the BB median. And it's not a coincidence that they also have a per capita income level, which is also higher than the BB median. So what we're trying to say is countries which are more economically diverse, countries which have greater financial penetration, for example, which Brazil also have the capacity to actually have a higher debt burden. Where Brazil does not look good, I think one chart on the bottom shows you interest to revenue. And here, even though Portugal and Croatia have higher debt burden than Brazil, the interest to revenue, which is a very key fiscal solvency ratio. If you see any country that gets into a real crisis and has a debt default, most of the times you'll also see their interest to revenue ratio is elevated. And Brazil's interest to revenue ratio, as you can see, is quite elevated. The other chart that I haven't put out here, but is also true, is that Brazil is the only other country in the BB category which has a high debt burden, and its debt burden is increasing. So if you have Serbia, Portugal, Croatia, all the three countries have either seen stabilization or are seeing debt coming down. So that's, again, gives you a picture or color for why we are on negative outlook. Now, the next slide, which is really talks about the rating and how we've arrived at the rating. So in an effort to boost transparency, we started publishing what the sovereign rating model, which is our proprietary model, tells us about Brazil's rating and how we come to the final rating. So our sovereign rating model actually puts Brazil at BBB minus, so still investment grade. We know that no model can capture all risks, and as such, we also have something called a qualitative overlay, where we make, as a committee, make judgments on 4 main buckets of our analysis. And in the case of Brazil, we've taken down Brazil in 2 notches. One notch, as you can tell, is on public finances. And that basically reflects the rapidly growing debt burden of Brazil, and a debt burden that is not going to stabilize anytime soon, and I have a slide on that as well later on. But also the highly rigid spending profile, which Cassina talked about, that really makes it very difficult to respond when a country faces economic shocks, and that we are amply seeing in recent years. The second notch that we take out is really in the structural features, which, if you look on the face of it, Brazil looks kind of strong with a very, higher per capita income, governance indicators, broadly in line with the BB category. But the political environment has truly been challenging and has meant that timely policy action has been very difficult to see through in Brazil. So that's the reason we've taken the notch out there. Moving on to our recent rating affirmation with negative outlook. First, why did we affirm the rating? I think the answer is is already being talked about here as well. We started seeing an improved economic environment, policy environment, sorry. And that was basically inflation coming down, as you can see in the bottom chart, inflation expectations getting better anchored. And the top chart just shows the external adjustment process that we've talked about. But why have we sustained the negative outlook for almost a year? I think even when things were stabilizing late last year, our view was that there were still political challenges. They were latent last year. They have come to the fore again in May, and that would continue to, detract from timely policy action. So why do we have a negative outlook? We have concerns on economic growth prospects. We have concerns on medium-term debt stabilization. And finally, we have concerns now, increasing concerns on the ability of the government to pass the fundamental social security reform, given the political uncertainties that have emerged. Very quickly on some of the challenges, these have been really talked about already. Growth challenge, I mean, that is very clear. Why it matters is because, yes, the spending cap is good, but to meet fiscal targets, economic growth also has to come up, because some of the reason why fiscal targets are becoming increasingly difficult to meet is because of the revenue underperformance as well. So growth challenge is a really important one. We're seeing household is clearly under pressure with unemployment rates going higher. Also credit growth, credit dynamics has been negative, both to the firms, but also to the households. And finally, potential growth aspect. I mean, if you look at the bottom right graph, you see that investment rate in Brazil was never high. It has only gone lower, right? So you've got a pretty big shock on the investment rate, which is now in 15-16% of GDP. So even though we recognize the microeconomic reform agenda of the Temer administration, we still think that investment rate is still quite low and needs to pick up for us to get more comfortable about potential growth going forward. Fiscal challenge, just two fiscal challenges, that I'll highlight here. First is the size of the hole. It's very big. We're talking about deficits which are around 9% of GDP. It's very difficult to see in any country, consolidation of this magnitude resting only on spending cap and resting only on spending cuts. Generally you start to see a balance emerge between tax measures and spending measures. And here the bad news is that Brazil's tax burden is not only complex, it's very high. So that reduces the maneuverability of Brazil. The second aspect or the challenge that we see is really related to rebuilding the fiscal credibility. If you look at the right-hand side graph, when the Temer administration and when the economic team came in, they had a path of fiscal consolidation that would lead to a balanced position and a primary surplus position by 2019. Earlier this year, that path was already changed. Now they're expecting that primary surplus and balance will only be reached 1 year later in 2020. If economic growth continues to disappoint, if revenue underperformance continues, we will not be surprised if we see yet another revision in fiscal targets. So clearly, that homework still needs to be done in terms of rebuilding fiscal credibility. And why that is important is because debt is not stabilizing in any of our scenarios. Debt burden continues to increase. We expect that even if you accept the baseline the government has in terms of reaching its primary balance in 2020, you still will have to see growth rates of about 3% in a couple of years to really get a shot at debt stabilization around 85% of GDP. So it's not an easy task at this point in time. And the other point we would say is looking at the negative scenario, you can clearly construct a scenario in which Brazil's debt to GDP can reach around 100% of GDP in the coming years. If we get stuck in primary deficit for longer, if growth fails to recover, then that's the scenario which obviously will be quite concerning and really raise concerns about debt sustainability. And finally, talking about politics, and there we would say there are a couple of points that I would say in this slide. First is Brazilians' trust in their own institutions, which seems to be at all-time low. If you look at the bottom right graph, where the trust in presidency has gone down quite considerably. But it's not only about the trust in presidency, it's also about trust in political parties, for example, in Congress, that is also quite low. So that is one aspect. The other aspect is the fragmented nature of the election at this point in time. Clearly, a lot of us are talking about, how eyes are now going to be moving towards the 2018 election. And clearly, I'm sure Liza is going to talk a lot about that. But really, elections are coming at a very delicate time. Trust in institutions is weak. You've got a fragmented election race. You've got weak economic growth. And you've got fiscal challenges which will be transferred to the new administration as well. So in many ways, you really need greater political leadership and capacity and willingness to tackle the political challenges of really curbing and reducing these fiscal imbalances. So clearly, our eyes would also be how reforms progress, both going into the election, but also what happens coming after the election. And finally, ending with the rating sensitivities. On the negative side, I think I would highlight the first two. If political volatility, if it continues to detracts from effective policy making and detracts from progress in reforms, that obviously will be negative for the rating, and so will be lack of fiscal consolidation and continued rapid growth in debt burden. For us to take off the rating from the negative outlook and stabilize the rating, two things to highlight, and clearly opposite of what I just said, we would have to see, again, a renewed improvement in the economic policy environment that lends itself to further reforms and helps restore confidence and growth and leads to fiscal consolidation and hopefully debt stabilization in the medium term. So I'll end here and give it back to you, Paolo.
Thank you very much, Shelley. I think that was extraordinarily clear and very comprehensive. And as we all are very much aware, so much depends really on the political outcomes. And we are very, very fortunate to have with us Luisa Palacio to take us through some of the highlights there and what is the outlook.
Thank you, Paulo. Really honored to be here and to share the panel with this amazing group of speakers. And thank you as well, Ted, for the invitation. Well, I'm talking about the elephant in the room, clearly. And what I would have to say, and I'm going to start with something that Paulo said, are markets being complacent about the risks going forward? And I will have to say that you have to divide that answer on the short-term political risk and on the more longer-term political risk linked to the elections. On the short-term political risk, I don't think so. Not only because of the things that both Danny and Claudia had mentioned about the environment in which this new political turmoil is taking place, but also because there's visibility in the markets about what the outcome is. If Temer doesn't survive the criminal case against him, Maya comes in and the economic team stays. So that gives you some anchor. So I don't think that the markets per se are being complacent about that specific risk, and I'm going to come back to it. What I do think is that makes it less likely that the pension reform is going to pass. Not only because, and I would use some of the things that we're looking at in the U.S. as well. It is very difficult to do a reform that has clear losers. And it's very difficult to do a reform with 70% of the population is against a year before the elections. So quite frankly, I think that we have to understand the political economy of that reform, which tells us that most likely, or at least our scenario right now, is that it doesn't pass. Even if we don't see a high risk probability scenario of the reform passing, we have the feeling that it will have a slightly higher probability where Maya come to power, just because of the newness of the new administration, of the freshness of a new government versus the clear bad goods that currently the President Temer represents, and the link between President Temer right now and the authorship of that reform in particular. So this is how we see the short-term risk. But looking more, I think the clear answer of whether the markets are being complacent about the long-term risk is yes, they're being complacent. There is, and I think because of all the things that Shelley has correctly mentioned, This is a very tough election. And let me start by saying we think that the most likely scenario is that the establishment is going to win that election, and as all of you have presented, that they will continue with the reform process going forward. But getting from point A to point B, what we can see is that the risks are asymmetric. Because right now, when I look at the polls, I see 30% that Lula has, despite everything that has happened, 30% approval rating. That the next two in line are tied at a 15% approval rating, and that those are the two anti-establishment candidates. We have a good anti-establishment candidate and a bad anti-establishment candidate. But what it's telling you is that the Brazilian voter is 30% of the Brazilian voter wants an anti-establishment candidate. So I understand that there are, and this is a very important point when we look at Latin American politics and we look about the outlook or the probabilities of outsiders entering into the political system. We do see that Brazil is one of those places where the rules of the game or the electoral rules make it very difficult for outsiders to really break into the political system. That said, again, this is a very particular election, and we still yet have to see what the political effect or the political implications of the Lava Jato will have on electoral politics. I would agree with Claudia that we're seeing probably the end of the process. That doesn't mean that we have yet to see how voters are going to react to it. So we don't know where the Brazilian voter is. We just know the things that the polls are telling us, which is that the Brazilian voters' trust in the institution is at an all-time high, and that right now they actually want an outsider, or at least a group of them want an outsider. So I think those are the things to consider. So when we look at the next 12 months, knowing that our base case scenario remains one that the establishment wins, we just look at the asymmetric risk that we're seeing, because before that scenario becomes evident to everyone, what we're going to have is that those polls, there's nothing to tell us that those polls are going to change. Because the other things that the Brazilian political system has that prevents from outsiders is the fact that you have the way that the campaign occurs, and particularly the distribution of TV time, is one of those things that stacks or helps significantly the establishment. But that doesn't happen until August, because the campaign really starts with the officialization of the candidates in June, and then the official campaign starts in August. So those benefits that are going to come to the establishment do not start until very late. In the meantime, what do you think the polls are going to show? Because as I've heard from everyone in this panel, it's not that things are going to get are going to improve significantly on the growth front, which is going to lead to people to forget what the last 12 months have been in terms of the narrative in the public opinion in Brazil. So what we see is that it just seems to us right now that the Brazilian electoral politics have asymmetric risks, and that, yes, the base case scenario is a market positive scenario, but it doesn't, to us right now, represent significant upside. And in the meantime, what you have is those risks stack against you. Now, the other thing to consider, and which I think is also relevant, is what is the mandate coming from that election? If indeed what you have is a political lineup that right now looks very fragmented, as Shelley was commenting, you don't know what that election is going to be. You don't know if that election is going to be about corruption. You don't know if this election is going to be about growth, about unemployment. Is that really an election where you're going to run on a platform of fiscal consolidation? And if that is the case, if you have to run also on a platform of delivering growth or a populist platform, what does that mean for the next government? So again, it just seems to us that you have significant risk going forward. And one of the things that we're looking at is what's going to happen in October. You have particular deadlines in the Brazil political elections, which are very, very relevant, and they're all in 2018. But in October, there's something very relevant that is going to happen, which is that Anyone who wants to run and wants to change party to have a more important political platform has to do so 12 months in advance, which means that in October we will have a little bit more of clarity, at least of how the stacks are moving and how fragmented that political lineup is going to be. What are the things that we're looking at? Is Mireles running? Because if Mireles is running, to us, the one risk that we see that could alter the probabilities that the establishment doesn't win is if the establishment goes divided. Because what we have learned in Latin America is that who gets divided loses. And we just saw this in one key election in Latin America, which was the Mexico elections, state elections for the state of Mexico, which was seen by markets as a proxy to what could happen in the June 2018 presidential elections in Mexico. What happened there is that the ruling elite, the establishment, had a candidate. It was not the greatest candidate, but the opposition had a very fragmented field. If the opposition had come up with one candidate, they would definitely have beat the ruling party pretty, but they didn't. So the establishment proved that money, that resources, that campaign structure matters, but it matters when you have a fragmented opposition. So the same thing happens with the establishment. The establishment cannot go divided. So if I see Mireles hinting that he's going to run, I would see this as a negative, not because I don't think that he could be a good president. It's because I don't think that that is positive from the point of view of the establishment, because it's clear that the PSDB is going to have a candidate. And so what you don't want is that center of the political spectrum to be divided, because the last thing that you want is and that's the other thing that protects Brazil from outsiders, is that you have a runoff, and that has proven to be very effective in Latin America. The runoff, what it does is that it prevents extreme candidates from becoming president, and it also moves the political spectrum to the center. It is the center candidate that ends up winning. So we have seen in Latin America, and we saw cases where, because of the division between the establishment or the center, you had a runoff with the worst case scenario. So the last thing that you want is a runoff with Lula and Jair Bolsonaro, because then you have no options. And so how do you prevent that? You prevent that by keeping the establishment. You have to see this election almost as an existential threat, because it is the one election where you don't know where the voters are going to go. It is an election that is presenting the groundwork for an outsider. And as we saw in U.S. politics, low-risk scenarios that we have seen in the past, in specifically when voters want disruption of the political system, become your base case scenario, even if no one was predicting that could be the possibility. So again, we're not here. I'm not telling you that that's what I think is going to happen. I'm just telling you we continue to believe that the base case scenario for Brazil is the rosy, the more positive scenario. But I think that what the last 12 months of elections, both in emerging markets and in the developed markets, have shown you is that those low-risk scenarios, but that have high impact, cannot be underestimated, and you cannot be complacent towards them. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the panel. This was really an exciting and very informative discussion. I want, before we open up to the Q&A, and I would like you to start thinking of your questions, I would like to give the panel a chance to respond to a bit of what they heard. And I also would like to start by asking Cassiana and others to comment on, today we have the Copom, we know there still is a short term before the elections. This could be a very tumultuous period. But in particular about monetary policy, of course, has been a success. And one of the curses of success is that you start thinking about how low can the rates go. And my particular answer to you, question to you, Cassiana, is, do you believe that it would be appropriate, first of all, where do you think this rate is going to end? And do you believe, thinking that 2018 is a political year and all of that, do you believe it would be appropriate for the central bank to push this rate well below the neutral, whatever this neutral rate could be, even for a transitory period, or do you think the Copom rather will be a little bit more cautious and get a rate that will sustain it through all of 2018? And then for the others in the panel, and particularly for the ones that are more politically inclined, I mean, and this question on the short run also for Danny very much, because I'd like to see your. But the other ones is we might have a political reform before the elections. I think that's quite likely. I would like to hear your views on the political reform. And we all know that with the Lava Jato and the things that came up, well, this campaign will be funded by the government, right? There will be very few others that will be funding. So this political reform, coupled with the idea that it will control how the government funds the campaign, could have a very big impact. So I'd like to hear your views on that. But please, let's start, Cassiano, and then we'll follow the same order.
No, sure. So in terms of monetary policy, I think I completely agree with what Claudia mentioned on her part. I think that's the only maneuver that the government has in terms of supporting growth in the short term. But the way that I see this central bank, they want they want the decrease in real interest rates to be sustainable. And the best way to do that is actually when they are actually behind the curve in the easing cycle, meaning that they can go further, they can continue to cut. I do expect them to cut rates 100 bips tonight and continue to cut up to 8% by October. But the way they are going to communicate, I think that is going to be very important. Why? Because at least in the short term, everyone has been surprised on inflation front. This inflation is much deeper and faster than what we were expecting a couple of months ago. It's true, a lot of transitionary impacts in terms of inflation, food inflation helping, but also if we look in terms of core inflation, I think that this inflation is quite widespread and do support the monetary policy easing. But at same point, the Copom members are divided because although the economic cycle, very low economic growth, and inflation below targets, inflation expectations well consolidated below target as well in the horizon of monetary policy, do recommend them to go rates much below neutral. At the same point, they are still the budget. They are still going through this debate, where is the neutral rates and actually what is the structural interest rates, because one of the main points of all the reform agenda that we talked extensively through, not only the pension reform, but the TLP reform that Danny mentioned so much, it's in a sense that they want to see lower structural rates. And we still do not see that. So the Copom is still they're still working on that, and they also don't have a conclusion on where this rate is. But the way that they can guide the markets is actually showing their inflation projections for the remaining periods, how they will behave with the markets consensus that now it's already below 8%. So I think that's the message that everyone will need to be looking at. Just before I pass to Danny to comment on Copom, but one thing on the political reform that you said, that probably, I think that this is the one consensus that you have in Brasilia. There's going to be a political reform. They have to, this is the main priority. This is also why I don't believe that they are going to discuss the pension reform this year as well, is because they need to approve any changes on the electoral law, needs to be approved 12 months before the next election. So that gives them up to end of September to approve these changes. And this is the main priority, everyone. And the only thing that center-right, center-left outsiders do agree of is exactly to approve this political reform.
Claudia, and then, or do you want to do in reverse? Whatever. Go ahead.
Okay.
Please, thank you.
Just briefly to mention that in terms of the interest rate, the central bank knows that the least cost of achieving this lower neutral rate is with having transparency, better enhanced transparency and credibility. And the central bank did a very interesting thing, which was to change the, which is to increase, to extend the inflation target to 2 years. This year, they actually set the inflation target to 2019 and 2020. And in 2015, the central bank actually did something also that was important, which is to reduce the range towards a point target, a long-term point target. So the range used to be 2%, plus or minus 2%. And then from this year on, it becomes 1.5%. So that's also an improvement of the regime. And I think this issue of transparency and credibility is very important to them. So provided that they are comfortable with that, I think the output gap is very significant and the disinflation is very significant as well. So I think the central bank will not fight necessarily the cyclical picture at this point. So that would be my view. Having said that, I think the TLP bill is very important, and I am not sure how things are going in that arena, because there's some smoke signals that comes out of BNDES regarding that, and I think that would be an important thing, this change in credit policy for actually the central bank be able to do that. In addition to reassurances that the fiscal policy side can be met, however difficult it is. Right now, it cannot be met, and I think the authorities know that it cannot be met. But the current numbers are the current numbers. They are not the numbers of tomorrow. The Brazilian authorities, they have a very comprehensive budgetary process where they evaluate and match revenues and expenditures every 2 months. So they know every 2 months whether they're going to be able to match or not match. There's some revenues they're expecting for September. And so, with the current numbers, they cannot meet the target. But perhaps with tomorrow's number, they can meet the target. And if not, they know what they have to do to meet the target. I think that will also be important for the central bank in terms of monetary policy.
Yeah, let me ask in that context before, and you can address it too, perhaps then, what happens if they change the target? If they accept a larger deficit for this year, would that change your expectations on interest rates?
Well, they must. So if you go back,
speak a bit closer to.
If we go back a year, and we look into the behavior coming out of the central bank in Brazil, it's pretty clear. It's a combination of change, right, of reforms with the inflation convergence, right? So it was always path dependent on different yardsticks or milestones when it came to reforms. First, it was the ceiling Then it was the labor reform bill, right, which was delivered, and now is the TLP. I think that the change in the ceiling for this year, they might be able to massage it, right? Having said all that, if I was at the central bank, I would probably have signaled that today. My plan is to actually cut only 75 basis points, and the reason is because I would like to increase pressure on both Congress and Senate not to do silly things over the next few months, and I think a reduction from 100 to 75 will give a very clear signal in that direction. So that will be my own policy decision if I was running the central bank in Brazil. I'm not, so my guess is that you will be going for 100. Now on. Going forward, I think the signal should, again, August 2nd is very important because we're going to have that vote in Congress. And then after that, the biggest attack on TLP is that Lindbergh, who is a fairly noisy figure at the PT party, is actually running one of the committees of the TLP. He might need to be replaced in some shape or form, but that will cause a lot of noise along the way. And that's the main hurdle when it comes to the TLP. Is this guy. So it'll be really important to watch out what exactly happens after August 2nd because no one is focused on that. Now, going to political reforms, Brazil has to find a way to finance campaigns, right? Because basically you took one and you didn't really replace with another. The problem is that the government providing money to political parties is clearly an issue. Right, so they need to decide how that is going to be resolved going forward because you had a system and you're replacing with nothing. So here it's a key problem. I mean, because you could end up with a very bad bunch of candidates as a result of that, right? So there is a very important process, explanatory process, to explain to the public what the hell is going on with campaign financing in Brazil. Right? And I don't think the government is doing a good enough job on that, right? Because all I see in my Facebook account is how bad whatever 6 billion reais are and so on and so forth, with no one really understanding that this is replacing whatever 20, 30, 40 billion, whatever the number was before, right? So this is a fraction of the money that was spent beforehand. A lot of it has to do because a lot of the money that was spent beforehand now is sitting in south of France or in some Swiss chalet. But it's a fraction of it, right? So it's a good thing, but still is money that Brazil is giving to political parties, which is something that Brazilians don't like, right? So there is a lot of work to be done in that front, and I honestly don't know what the solution is. I mean, you probably better skill to answer that question.
Not much on the political reform. I guess on the interest rate, I mean, I think we do have a luxury at being a rating agency that we don't have to kind of pinpoint what the terminal rate would be. Our working assumption is that, rates around 8.5%, terminal rate. And that still leaves Brazil's real rates very high. Even if you believe that inflation, after dipping this year to below our target, goes up to 4.5%. Next year, you're still talking about very, very high real rates. I think, from the chart that I showed earlier, I think what is key for us in terms of credit metrics is that that this rebuilding process on the monetary policy side, which we think is well on course, is sustained. That's basically what we're looking for. And from that perspective, as long as inflation expectations are well anchored, as long as the central bank shows its commitment to calibrate policies depending on how fiscal risks or reform risks are coming to the fore, that's how would we would be looking at it. And final point on real rates is that in some ways to improve your debt dynamics, you need lower real rates, right? You need to somehow either boost growth or lower the R in the R minus G equation, right? So, to the extent that Brazil can sustain lower real rates, I think that would obviously be good news for fiscal dynamics and debt dynamics, provided the government sticks on its primary balance consolidation path. So, what we have seen earlier this year, again, going back to that chart, is that with the, prepayment to the Treasury of the BNDES loans last year, with the expectation that real rates were going down this year, we basically saw that the primary balance was relaxed. So, if real rates come down, it is still quite essential that, the underlying dynamics which are held by the primary balance are also maintained. Not much to say on the political reform, although I do agree with Kasiana. I think that there is a traffic jam that could happen in Congress, right? And because of the political reform and other issues that are also coming through the allegations related to President Temer himself. So that further casts doubt on the passage of the Social Security reform. And the other thing that Daniel mentioned as well, I don't think the numbers are that big in terms of the fiscal costs that might be associated with this political, if the government has to finance this is not, not sure where the numbers are. But again, that again puts another pressure point for the 2018 fiscal accounts.
One of the lessons about the political economy of corruption is that corruption occurs in the intersection of states and markets, or the government and the private sector. So getting the private sector out of campaign financing is actually a pretty good idea. So I think that is a step forward. And what I would say is that the political reform that is currently being discussed, it's not really the political reform that Brazil needs, by the way. But granted, you need to solve that issue, and it just seems to me that that's going to actually probably increase the probabilities that the establishment wins, because that money is going to be distributed according to your seats in Congress. But more importantly, I think at the end of the day, what we see from the political science perspective is that Brazil has one of the most fragmented congressional systems, or political systems, in the planet. And that makes it very, I'm not kidding you. It's actually, there are people that have tracked or ranked Brazil. So, and it just makes it extremely difficult to be able to negotiate anything in Congress, because how do you keep together 10 parties, 27 political parties, but your ruling coalition is at least 10 parties. It is extremely difficult to do that without rent-seeking. And so to me, that you have that the most important party in Congress has only 13% of the seats, that would be a super minority government in any other country. So that, to me, is at the heart of the problem. So you can solve, and I think that Lavallato and his iterations through the JBS and Odebrecht scandal are cleaning up the system, but you have there's a structural problem there that I think ultimately will need to be resolved to make governance much more easier and rent-seeking much less needed. So yes, that political reform clearly is needed, and again, it just seems to me that it stacks the odds in favor of the establishment. On the August 2nd and the Temer issue itself, is that right now what we see is that Temer survives that vote in Congress, because 342 votes is a lot of votes. But this is not over. It's just then, the general prosecutor will come up with another case against it. So it's about the traffic that you're having, because until September, when you have a renewal of the general prosecutor, you're going to be in this, and that pushes the whole agenda forward, unless the Supreme Court comes, intervenes, and said, you have to vote right now and you cannot delay votes. But in general, I just think that Congress, the political... the problems of Temer's survival, what it does is just that it complicates the legislative agenda and pushes everything or delays everything. I think that's the way to see it.
Okay, well, yes, we have a lot of food for thoughts and many, many ideas that came through. So I would encourage you to think about the questions and come forth with your questions right now. Yes, please. I think, wait just a second, Egan, yes, there's a microphone there.
Hello?
Yes.
Good morning. Can you hear me? Yes, there's some sound. Thank. I'm Jean Argos. I'm chief economist for Tigress Financial Partners in New York. I also teach at NYU, among minor activities. One question I have is this. It was an excellent panel, excellent presentation, but I got a tremendous insight into the financial economy. I'd like to know more about the real economy in Brazil. Now, I'm not saying that the financial economy is the noise, but we're speaking a tremendous amount about interest rates and the extent to which actually these reductions in interest rates actually percolate down certain economies to the masses and to corporates of all different shapes and sizes is somewhat disparate. So what I'd like to know is, what is your view on one thing I consider to be a signal, which is foreign direct investment into Brazil? Because I get the feeling a lot of times when I look at certain emerging markets, there's a tremendous amount of talk about the noise and the political climate and everything else. And then we see people continuing to invest. Last January, at the worst of it, there were big multinationals who were buying out their Brazilian minority partners with very cheap reais at that point. So what is your view on that? And can we see that in any way as a sign of confidence that, A, the economy will basically hold, the country will not regress, let's put it this way, drastically, and that much more important thing in the case of Brazil, and you highlighted the rise of the middle class, that there will not be social disaggregation, which will break consumption, where a lot of these multinationals are present.
Danny, you want to talk about the FDI, and then other people maybe also on the...
So just very quickly on the FDI story, which I think is very important. Brazil is an interesting country in the sense that 200 million people that have a very, very high consumption to GDP ratio, right? And it's interesting that even though China is a huge economy, 5 times the size of Brazil, they save 50% of their GDP, right? So when you're looking from a multinational perspective, Brazil is an extremely attractive place to be involved because Brazilians love to shop, right? That's just where it is, right? So you end up with, you have that massive pie that is out there, and as a result, you have all that FDI coming in, right? So a lot of the FDI is not necessarily a reflection of the good productivity you have in Brazil, right? Because Brazil really exports almost nothing. I mean, it's like it's really about the domestic market. So that's point number one. Point number two is when it comes to interest rates, which I think is a very important point. A lot of what's happening in Brazil today means interest rate convergence going forward, right? Again, I cannot underestimate how important the TLP story is, but it really reflects a whole range of reforms in the financial system that will be very, very critical to watch going forward. Households' credit to GDP in Brazil is tiny. And the reason is because even during the heydays, you couldn't really get finance. I mean, you would get some subsidized, but it would be like for 2 years at 8% rates, 9% rates, right? So you still have, and that was like, it was once in a lifetime type of funding. You don't have that anymore. So there is, the TLP will improve and will trigger convergence in interest rates that should be supportive to household credit in Brazil. And I think that's one of the things that would critically bring that convergence in the back end in Brazil, that the Brazilian back end rate is so high compared to the front end.
Cassiana, you want to say something on the credit side in particular?
One point also on FDIs. I think that's going forward. And just to add, I agree with what Daniel said on current flows. But also, I think that it's important to have in mind is the government perception, finally, that we have a huge gap, a huge bottleneck in terms of infrastructure investments in Brazil. And now there is the perception, I mean, finally the government realized that they cannot fund it. There is no room for the government to fund these infrastructure projects. So, and that's one important part of the reform agenda is actually improving the regulation legislation in order to be more attractive to private investment. And because of the lack of domestic savings in Brazil, less than and 15% of GDP lately, the only way to do that is to be attractive to foreign investments. So I think that this, at least in the medium term, we should continue to see inflows in terms of FDIs. Of course, if we have in mind that the positive scenario after 2018 election moves forward, that goes, it's realized. So also in terms of credits, I think that this is one of the main externalities of the TLP. It's not just about the fiscal burden, because there is a huge fiscal burden. I mean, if the government gives money at 7% interest rates and pay for 20, 30 years and pays an overnight interest rates is still up to tonight at 10.25. Of course, there is a huge fiscal cost in doing that. But also, as you have 25, BNDES now has 25% of the outstanding amount of credit in Brazil. This also means that the average, although we're just saying, well, Brazil has is still one of the highest real interest rates in the world, but the truth is the average interest rate is not that high, because 25% of the credit market has almost zero real interest rates. I mean, if we look in the past. So I think that's going to be another positive externality, and that's also to improve a lot the credit markets going forward because of all this misallocation. I mean, it's not just, I mean, I don't, I've worked in BNDES, so that, I mean, I do know their credit standards. It's not something just about the corruption, but there is definitely a misallocation of the capital, because the interest is not to increase profits and increase efficiency at all times. So I think this is also another positive developments of this of the changes on the TLP, and going to your how we see credit markets in Brazil.
By the way, just a footnote on this one, so I have to clarify, right? BNDES always gave money to very, very solid companies. They produced the Brazilian champions, right? The only problem was that the Brazilian champions had to pay a fee to get that money. That was the issue, right?
Not always.
All right,
always.
so let's just move on. Please, Mark. Just a second. I think that it's coming very quickly to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Claudia made a comment in the context of the limits of Lava Jato that there's a risk of criminalizing an entire political class. And it reminded me of a comment I think made in this forum about 3 years ago by Chris Garman, who was one of the first in the early days of Lava Jato, who kind of likened the risk to be like Italy in the 1990s, where you had, hundreds of politicians kind of caught up in this. So I guess my question is, how does this all end? Does this grind on for years? Does it peter out after the election? Is there some cathartic event? Everybody claps and goes home? I mean, what happens next?
Luisa, will you lead us on that?
Yes, thank you. I think it's difficult to provide a definite answer. I think the way Lava Jato has proceeded is that it went through the corporate sector first, and now it's going through the political system. I'm not sure if this is going to end with a major leader of each party going to jail, so that you provide the example that you need, or the justice system provides the example that it needs to all political parties. I do think that it is. I fear that just having Lula go to jail might not necessarily be a good thing from the political narrative of cleaning up the system. But in general, what I would say is that you do feel that there's a fatigue starting to set in. I think the elections, to me, will be or a thermometer of how much willingness there is from voters to continue with this process. I think if the next year's elections, voters just won, the elections is about corruption, is about cleaning up, then you get a mandate from voters again. It just seems to me right now, it seems that this is we're probably closer to the end, although you do have a lot of outstanding criminal cases against politicians open that they have to come to conclusion. So what I would say is that the next 12 to 8 months, we know that this is because the big scandals or the big plea bargains already are out there, and we already know that where this is going. So you would imagine that, and I think I agree with Claudia that that probably 2018 and the elections could be the peak, provided that the corruption does not become the main leitmotif of this election, because then you get another breather into this agenda. In general, I think that because it is about the way the system worked, and it's because of the rules of the game, and it's because of the structural issues of the political system, I think it will help to have political reform of the real kind in order to complete this process. If not, it will have to be a generation. You will have to wait for 10 years until new politicians come into play. I think it already showed that the way forward. What I mean by that is that you're being punished by past actions. I will be very, very surprised if the political system had not learned. And so going forward, I do think that you made going to jail a real threat. And one of the things that when we look at, and we've looked at studies, and I say this because corruption has become the #1 issue of a lot of the political campaigns in Latin America. This is by the way, the campaign of López Obrador in Mexico. So corruption is in the middle of all the political campaigns in Latin America. And what we have learned about corruption in Latin America is that the judicial systems in Latin America are very weak. And so the threat of going to jail is very low. So the cost of corruption is low. So Brazil is actually the first to actually significantly increase the cost of corruption. So the way we are of the view that this is positive in the long term. We understand that transitional costs are high, but we do think that by raising the actual going to jail, the cost of corruption in a significant way, I do think that that's enough to change future practices. The thing is that you have a legacy issue that you have to deal with, and you will have to make decisions about how far you're going to go. And it just seems to me that we're not there yet, but we are going to see more heads falling. And at some point, I think the 2018 elections will have to give you another mandate. Otherwise, I think it does start to ease.
Claudia.
Yeah, just to make a quick point, I had the fortune and then the misfortune of living in Italy during the Mani Pulite process. And the 2 points to make is that the process, not just Chris Garman, by the way, but also Judge Moro analyzed very profoundly the process over there. Not just the fact that the process sort of waned. The problem also was that there was no institutional safeguards to maintain or to change the system and maintain the incentives on, as Luisa was saying, to increase the cost of doing that malpractice or the corruption. I think that's a very important thing, because the other way to be able to get entrenched this higher cost of doing corruption, for example, is a cultural thing, and that takes a long, long time. And there you see differences in Latin America where some is more tolerated and less tolerated in some places. So if you cannot do it via culture change right away, the one way where, it could be done, I guess what I'm suggesting is that there should be a thought process as to what should be done legislatively, perhaps, or judicially. I mean, to ensure that these things are actually criminalized, are actually, sustained those gains from higher cost of doing that. And the second point to make is that I forgot what the second point was.
It will come back to you, Claudia. But let me just add one thing to make this thing even more complicated. I mean, one of the issues that people talk a lot about in Brazil nowadays is the so-called the judicialization of politics, and the cost of the judiciary system in Brazil. So there are many aspects of what the longer run impact of all of this will be. And I think one of them is going to be to really see where does that separation of powers really continues to be in the future. So I think there are many open questions and very few concrete markers at this point. Sorry. Yes, please. Are we almost time? Okay, so maybe one last question if there is, and then we'll finish. Okay, José Roberto. Excuse me. There's...
What I was saying that I think it is still expected a Lava Jato of the judiciary in Brazil, which has not been self-examining their own situation. And everybody knows that there is no corruption without the judiciary also being part of that. And it's a very clear case in Brazil. I think we should expect that.
No, and there is also the case of what if we really believe in the labor law reform, what do we do with that parallel legal system of the system of labor courts and all of that? So there are big issues. But anyway, thank you very much, everyone, for coming, and thank you, our panel. I thought we had a wonderful discussion.